Welcome to the Tracing Layer series. This is the 4-section series all about the tracing layer system. And in this particular section, we are going to be going over the photo selection. And this will help us pick out what photo we're going to use, what photos work best, what we are even actually willing to try, whether it be just something more simple or if we want to pick out a photo that may have some freehand involved. This one here is the one I picked for the final demonstration, and that is just more or less all tracing with very little freehand. And this is one of the easier ones that we could do, only because it's just pretty much all planes and then just a little bit of light and dark changes. But as far as painting or drawing it out, it wouldn't have been too much or too bad as far as fine detail work. Now, keep in mind, all the photos we're going to go over in this particular section are of my own, and I am giving myself the permission to use them. That is worth mentioning, only because I originally got into photography to have my own references to paint from. And now I actually just keep some photos just for photographic sake and not tangle them up with any of the references I use for my paintings. I don't want my paintings looking identical to my photographs or vice versa. That way, I just use bits and pieces of having a painting look like a photograph is kind of very slim, but I still wouldn't want any resemblance between the two. Now, in this particular section, I'm going to go over the selection of photos and then the issues we can have with photos, chromatic aberration, noise, and then also very important angle of view. And what I mean by that is if we start using a wide angle and how many issues that could create in a photograph. And then also if we do have some issues with a photograph, then maybe we could even consider changing it to black and white. And I'll show you briefly how to do that. And then at the very end, we're just going to go over some suggestions of what to look for as to when you see or come across a photo or something you might want to do as a painting, and then just help us better understand how we could get a better photograph, because that will definitely determine whether or not it's going to be a better painting. With that said, we will get started and go right into the selection section of our photographs and determine what may be good to start out with or what may be a little bit more difficult that might need some freehand. Our first folder is the selection, and we'll just go over the difficulty and lighting. The very first photo I picked, that one is fairly easy, only because it's just nothing more than planes and just a little wee bit of detail in the lamp. But keep in mind, you could even enlarge your canvas and then work a little bit more finer detail if you have to. But there's still no like single stroke lines or fine furry feathers or things of that nature where you have a lot of line or what I would call script work. The next one is actually a little bit more intense, but it's still all flat planes that would be fairly easier to do than a lot going on. The leaves up here would be a little bit of a fine texture, but then you don't even have to put those in. You could just paint over those or photo retouch them out in the photo retouch section. But then you may have a little wee bit more ornamental work here and a little bit more detail, but everything else is still flat planes with just a little wee bit of color changes from the sandstone themselves. Now I'm going to try and include a little note to each photo. And in this one, I actually photographed it where I was intentionally, because if I would have moved a little wee bit more to the right, then this lamp would have been up against this black right here, and it would have been completely gone and lost. So just as a suggestion, sometimes, especially when you're using wide angle lenses, move around a little bit and see how your objects are changing and see if something starts to look confusing to you as you take the picture. Kind of take your time and think a little bit and then see how you can improve your photo just because of the position you're using to take it. especially wide-angle lenses, because even moving a foot or two can change your image quite a bit when you have objects in the foreground. Of how they appear in the foreground, they could still be in focus, but how they appear and their location to the foreground could make a very big difference. Now, the next one is just a classic landscape and a snow scene, but again, it's still all plains with the snow and the rocks. But again, now where you'll start to get into a little bit of texture and detail are going to be the hemlock trees. There, they could either just be rendered as green trees or green shapes, if you will, with a little bit of snow on them, or you could go to town and actually just put in the finer detail of that texture and render it more accurately to the photo itself. But again, though, you still have the majority of the painting with just color changes in the water, and then pretty much all white with very little shadow and shape changes due to the lighting. And then in the final one is the cardinal I already did as a demo, and I used the tracing layer to get my base colors down, which was very quick since I'm not constantly going back to my palette, grabbing a new color, going over it, or even the color picker. The color picker will only work on a painting if you already have the colors down. And I say that because I have my pen set as the first click will be my color picker. And then I could instantly pick colors and then keep working. But then it also changes me right back to a brush, which also helps. But this particular photo was a little bit more difficult because I changed over to freehand fairly early in the painting. And as soon as the influence layers go off, when there's no buttons over here, then that's it. You're on your own. You have to pick your own colors. And you're also freehanding in the sense that you're not tracing anymore. So there's two things that are happening there if it's not an influence layer. You can't trace anymore, and you have to pick your own color. Now, moving on to the lighting suggestions, whether it be the subject itself in different lighting situations could very well determine if it's just going to be okay or if it's just going to be a lot more dramatic. Now, granted, dramatic lighting will give you a dramatic picture, but sometimes it's not flattering as to the subject. So in this one in particular, this is a statue in 3 different types of lighting, and watch the differences of how much it could change just because of the lighting. And this one, the lighting is coming straight down to the front of the statue, and it's kind of flattening out. You have a little bit of shadows and a little bit of texture and form because of them, but like, for example, this gargoyle is kind of seen only because he's mostly shadows up against a light background, but then the highlights of it are all lost, so I don't know if you'd really want to see just the shadowed areas because that is the majority of the gargoyle. And then now, if we go to the next one, this one, the lighting is high up over your right shoulder, down coming pretty hard in midday sun. Now you have a hard shadow up against the building, but then again, the gargoyle is kind of lost up against the wall because all of the highlights are still the same color as the actual background wall. And then the statue and the pillar that it's on is the same thing. It's kind of flattening out very bad, that this is just color change with no shadows, only that you have a little bit of shadows right here in the sleeve and underneath the book, and then a little bit on the face, but then it's making it dark eyes. In photography, we call those shark eyes, and that is a shadow from your forehead that completely makes the eyes socket go black, and it sometimes make people look dead, that they have no eyes, no life, no anything. So that is something to consider. But now the final one, this lighting is all reflected light on the shadowed side, and then you have a hard light coming from your right, and now the gargoyle you could see very well, And since you have a ton of reflected light from other objects that are not in the picture, then you could still see these shadowed areas pretty good, but you could really see the highlighted face of the gargoyle because it's up against a dark background now. And then you could see how the shadows are even being created from objects over here that are kind of splashing across that back wall. And in this particular photo, being that it's a late evening sun, you could even go to town with starting off with washes of orange and even lighter yellows just to get you started, very light yellows, just to get you started, then start taking layers of watercolors or paints over that, especially if you're working transparent or even semi-transparent. But this photo I would pick over the other three. This one, if I turn this one off, there's the other one, and then there's the first one. So you can even see how much of a difference this actually makes just by going to this one. And then I would definitely use this one as a painting reference. And again, it's the exact same subject, but just in 3 different lighting situations. Now we'll move on to the chromatic aberration, and that is problems that you could have in real fine detail of your photograph and maybe not realize it. Moving on to chromatic aberration, we will turn this one off and then go to this section. And in our first example is a typical landscape, and this is known as rime ice. That is actually fog that freezes on objects it floats by. Very interesting, somewhat rare, but in this particular picture, we actually don't see too much out of the ordinary when we start moving around as to just to see what kind of quality we would get until we come up into this tree area. Now, this tree area right here is actually this photo right here, and you could see this is a close-up of what it looks like, and this is what's called lateral chromatic aberration. And think of it as just how the light rays do not line up on the sensor, and it would almost be equivalent to the misprint of a comic section. If you've ever seen the colors not printed correctly that line up exactly, one color may be off a little bit, that is roughly the same thing. But for our intents and purposes, you could start grabbing these odd turquoise blue and magenta red colors out of your picture and not know where they're coming from. Now, if we correct that, if we have a way to correct that, that's good. That would be this image right here, and now it's corrected. So here it's corrected, here it is not. So with that said, be careful that if you start grabbing odd colors throughout your photograph, you may not realize where they're coming from, but they are there. And the reason why I say that is because the tracing layer system uses a color picker of up to 5x5 pixels. That's what mine is set at. And that's not a very big area, especially when I'm working at 300 DPI. That is literally only 1/60th of an inch. So with chromatic aberration in mind, just keep a lookout for things that could cause color changes that you may not know where the color is coming from, or may not expect that particular color, but it is there. Now, let's move on to noise. Photographic noise could come from a couple of different reasons. In this one, the example we're using now is an overexposed or underexposed photo. Once you start overexposing or underexposing your image, then you're going to start getting noise. Now, in this particular section of 3 photos here, this one is overexposed, this one is properly exposed, and then this one is underexposed. Now, with this 3 bracketed photos section of images of the exact same thing, but they were taken 3 different settings, we have the ability of creating what's called an HDR, just a high dynamic range image. But if you have that ability, that is great. That will give you a very good image, and this is what they would look like all together. That would be this one right here. Now there, again, you have really nice twilight sky. The lights are there, but they're not too bright. The darks are dark, but the lights are also light. What you're doing is actually taking the best out of each picture, the properly exposed areas of each picture, and combining them all together. And that will be a combination of the three. Now, if you don't have that ability, then what you can end up with is either an overexposed or underexposed photo if the lighting situation is pretty difficult. And that would be if you have a very small light source, or if you're looking right at your light source. There are plenty of different reasons that could cause a difficult lighting situation. But now, with that in mind, if you do have an over-adjusted or under-adjusted photo, that would be this one right here. If I start to try and take a dark photo and lighten it up, then I may end up with this. But then if we look close, I will start to get noise as far as the red, green, and blue dots will start to show up. And here is actually a close-up of that. And if we go in even closer, then you could really start to see that there are reds and greens and blues that are making up the noise from an over-adjusted photo. And if we start grabbing those colors out of our photo, then we may not know or expect a red to come out when we grab the color again in the tracing layer. But it is there. So again, be careful with the photos that you're using as far as the exposure. It may be an issue also, whereas the properly exposed photo would give you a much better result as far as true to life colors that you're going to be pulling out of your photograph. Okay, let's go on to angle of view, and this is a big one. In the angle of view folder, we'll see some examples of how reflections and actually a wide angle can really distort and exaggerate our picture. We open this up and then go to our first image. This is actually taken with a Canon 16 to 35 millimeter f2.8 version 3, or Mark 3 if you will, USM. Now all of that is fairly important because that's a rather good lens, but being that it's a rectilinear lens, most lenses are rectilinear. And we need to mention this right off the bat because a rectilinear lens means that your vertical lines, when shot level and centered, will remain nice and vertical. Otherwise, if it was not a rectilinear lens and an ultra-wide angle lens view, your vertical lines will start to appear in an arc shape, and they will actually be distorted and not remain vertical. Now, with our center lines and guides in place, this is what we would get if we actually just photographed it level and centered horizon. We would have nice vertical lines. But shooting it this way is not going to give us very many options of how we could arrange the picture. For example, if I turn these two off and then turn this one on, this is the same image area of trees, and I actually faced up. I have a very low horizon line, so this means the camera is looking up, and now all my trees are converging dramatically in an upward fashion. This is going to exaggerate my perspective. But with that said, here is the exact opposite. This is actually looking down, and now all my vertical lines are going to converge in a downward fashion. But this is just perspective. I picked this particular picture because remember I said that in some photography, or how you arrange your picture, it could change dramatically. This is actually the tripod leg of my tripod in the picture, so the lens to a certain extent is literally facing straight down. That's why this is kind of a straight up and down aerial view of these ferns here, and then you start to go out to where you're looking more right at them at eye level. But keep in mind, again, if I did not do this, then I would be very limited as to what I would get. And keep in mind also, compositionally, I don't want my horizon line constantly in the center just to get straight up and down vertical lines, even photographically speaking. Now, some photographers will either leave their images this way and call it a forced perspective, or actually correct their vertical lines but still keep that same wide angle look. That is a personal choice. But now that perspective can actually create some issues, especially on water. And if I bring up my first sample, again, I'm looking down because I have a very high horizon line, and this cleat right here is actually only a few feet away from the camera. But now, since everything is nice in focus, that is where the term point and shoot came from, because with wide and ultra wide angle lenses are very forgiving with depth of field. You just aimed it anywhere and your image is going to be in sharp focus. That is because of the wide angle lens you're using, but it's only going to give you a fairly narrow choice of how you could photograph something. Now, in this particular photo, because of me looking down and the camera facing down, the towers of this bridge are actually converging in. And that is something we could show with our guides. And what it is doing is the towers are converging in because of the exaggerated perspective. But now keep in mind, if we didn't know these towers were actually perfectly plumb, which they are, and we thought that they were actually leaning out, then here's another issue we're going to come into, and that is reflections. And that is, if the tower is leaning out to the left, so should the reflection. It should be going out to the left too, and then this one is leaning to the right. The reflection should also be leaning to the right. So in other words, our reflections are actually converging too. And the way we could show that and demonstrate that is with our next example, and that is this one right here. And we'll turn this one off. This tower is pretty much in the center of the photograph. So we know that if we keep our horizontal and vertical lines centered as far as level and centered, then our object will remain vertical. But now this tower over here is starting to go towards the right side of the picture. It's going to converge. Even these short lines here in the foreground are already converging. But again, now look at the reflections. This reflection of this tower is nice and straight, and this reflection is starting to converge. And that is because we will use the next example to explain that. And that is because, keep in mind, if you were standing here and you looked at this object, which is the lighthouse, obviously it's going to be reflecting right back at you. But now if you turned as much as 70, 80 degrees and looked at another object, it's also going to be reflecting right back at you. But if you have the ability to photograph both objects in the same picture, then the reflections will also converge. Now, artistically speaking, what would we do with that? Would we actually show converging reflections, or would we do it more traditional and keep the reflections parallel to the side of the painting? That we could demonstrate with this one. And here now, if I put my guides up, this one was photographed with a 35mm lens, which is a lot narrower angle, and it will not distort or exaggerate perspective as much as an ultra wide. So now our towers are nice and straight, and so is our reflections. So just be careful as far as using wides and ultra wide angle lenses. You may start to get some issues as far as how more or less how accurate something is represented in a photograph, and whether it should be true to nature or not, or true to life. For this reason, then, we have to use our common sense and figure out how would we use that photo. If we want to see that much of a wide angle of view, that's great, but we may have to change some things and adjust for our painting or our artwork itself. because if you have a very short distance you could photograph something, then that's when a wide angle will really come in handy. But it also may distort what you're seeing and how you're going to see it. Now, let's move on to black and white and how it could help us in some lighting situations. Moving on to the black and white folder, I will turn these two off and then open this one up, and our first example will be from the overexposed photographs. And again, considering that if you cannot end up with a respectable exposure because of a tough lighting situation, then you may want to even consider making it into a black and white. And then all you have to do is go up to filter and then hit desaturate. And then now, as long as you have the preview selected, you will be able to adjust in the red, green, and blue as far as channels you are adjusting. And this will allow you to correct some of that exposure, but keep in mind you're correcting it in all shades of gray. So no matter what you pick out of the photo in the tracing layer system, it will just be a shade of a gray. And there again, now the blue, if I want to darken my sky, I could take that down some or turn it up, but again, it will be all shades of gray. If I want to tone my lights down, I could do that also, but then keep in mind, as long as it is gray, then that's the only values you will be working from is values of gray. If you apply it, then that is it. That's what you will get, but you may want to keep a backup copy of your photo, because once you apply the settings, it is permanent. But now what makes a good black and white also, if you even just want to do a black and white, because keep in mind, again, you can actually do it in pencil or charcoal, and you could also then design your own brushes to get what effect you want from a pencil or charcoal drawing. But as long as you have contrast in your photograph, it's going to create a decent black and white for me. Now, this one in particular is okay whether it be color or black and white. Now, here's the color version. And the reason why it has a ton of contrast is because I'm looking right into the sun, but then also there is frost in the foreground. So it's creating everything with kind of like a dusting of white on it, and that is the frost, where other objects in the foreground may go fairly dark, but they're not just because of the white. Now, if I change this one into a black and white, then this is what I will get. And it still has a ton of contrast and would probably make a pretty respectable charcoal or pencil drawing. But if you want to work from a black and white, if you're a pencil artist or a charcoal artist, then obviously consider photographs that would appear good in black and white, but then keep in mind that is the photographs that have a lot of contrast and not necessarily color, because when you look at blues, purples, even reds and greens, they all may turn into a gob of medium gray, and that's it. Where now, if you're also working with tough colors, such as this one, then you may want to turn this into black and white also, because although the lobster buoys want to be seen from a distance, this fluorescent yellow that almost has a greenish cast in the reflections would be a pretty tough painting to work with, unless you really want something of those values of fluorescent colors. But then if I change it into a black and white, then this is what I would get. A completely different look than the fluorescent yellow. Again, though, now, if you're looking for pencil or charcoal references and you first see this, it may not look too much at first glance, but then if you do change it into a black and white, then that's not a bad image that you can actually do a decent pencil or charcoal drawing of. Now, if you want to experiment even with whether it be photographs, this one in particular, I actually created that into a sepia tone, and I took this patch of snow out, and then this is what I got. But now, if you want to do that, as far as just creating a sepia tone. That's not too difficult at all. We could go back to this picture here, and we'll create this into a sepia tone. And all you have to do is go up to Filters, and then hit Colorize, and then put this one at 30, this one at 30, and then your strength at 100, and then you will get a pretty decent sepia tone effect. Now, this could be done for portraits or old buildings. If you wanted to create that old antique look, then this could help you and already have your values of sepia in the photo. So when you start using the tracing layer, it's also going to pull those values of sepia out of the photograph, and you would be ready to go and let the tracing layer system work for you. Now, in the last choice of black and white, what it would also be is the lighting situation. Again, if you have really difficult lighting situations, then this one is looking right into the light, and mostly everything that is in front of the light is going to appear very dark in a silhouette unless you have the ability to create a rather good HDR. And I say good because if it's a very difficult lighting situation, then some photographers may even choose to have a 5 or 7 stack bracketing sequence to stack all those pictures together, so the gradation between the lighting is much more closer than having a very wide lighting bracket to try and add those together. It's going to be less smooth of a transition from one value to the next. But in this one, if I just take this really hard lighting situation and turn it into a black and white, then my colors of the greens up in here are not going to be washed out. And then also my trunks of the pine trees are almost going black. But again, this could make for an interesting pencil or charcoal drawing reference. Now, the next folder of pictures is actually just going to be the suggestions and just to what to look out for, whether it be when you're in the field or you're just looking for photographs to use. That will be what we will do next, and we will start off with the abstract folder next. Let's start with the abstract folder. And again, these will all be just suggestions what to look for. In this particular picture, this is ice, and this is a fairly close-up picture of the ice, but this is the actual colors that are being refracted by the ice in a very unique way. And then you could see that there is just some snowflakes here and there on top of the ice. And again, this type of searching will help your creativity for both photography and art. If you're already an artist and you're looking to improve your photography skills for better references, you'll actually find that you may improve your photography just for photographic sake. If you're a photographer looking for references to paint from, then you will also then find working at a creative or especially a freehand level of art will also improve your photography. You will just look at things different from a different way of perspective and or creativity. And our next picture would actually be another abstract looking photo, but this is going back to the photo I took of the boat at the very end of the photo retouch series. And this is actually the reflections of the buoys on the boat itself. And again, just zooming into a small area could really show things in a different way. One that some may not, be able to crop in on an image that's already there within another image. On our next one is actually water. Now this is going to be experimenting with shutter speed. If you have the ability to work with shutter speed, then this is stopping the water perfectly. And this is crystal clear water of Lake Superior up at what's called Black Rock Prescal Park. And what it is very colorful rocks in shallow water. This water is only about 2 or 3 feet deep. But it is that deep. But then the waves are actually diffracting and breaking up the reflections of the pebbles underneath. You could see them a little bit more here, or maybe in here, this pebble right here, but then this is reflecting the skylight. This is reflecting the skylight, but then this is actually centered in on the sunlight hitting the bottom of the lake itself at 2 or 3 feet deep, and this is what it's actually doing to the pebbles, and it's completely distorting it. But because it's clear water, and I used a fast shutter speed, it just stopped the action, which is something you may not see just by standing there looking. You may get a glimpse of it, but by stopping it and freezing it in action, you will really see what a particular scene may look like. In creativity, there's also nature at its best. This is Picture Rocks from also the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. And this is actually the colors of minerals leaching from the side of the cliff running down. And it is creating colors and patterns that are very unique. But even photographically, creates a very unique photo. But to use this as a reference, you may have to explain that this can actually happen in real life, because sometimes a photo that's unique used as a painting reference could actually look unnatural as a painting, and some folks may not realize that that could really exist. Now, this looks familiar. This is actually a close-up of one of the towers of the Rachel Carson Bridge, and this is what the water was doing to the reflection. And again, this is only a reflection. So this is giving a unique view of just what the water was doing to the reflection of the bridge, but more importantly, again, a fast shutter speed that just stopped the action and froze the water right where it was in that moment in time. Now, these are just some abstract examples. If you want to paint abstract, let's move on to the architecture. In architecture, these are going to be some of the photographs that are going to be easily accessible with very little camera equipment, or just even a cell phone or whatever you may be using. Now, a classic barn in any type of setting would be a pretty good reference to create a pretty reliable painting, or drawing for that matter. With a classic barn used as a reference, then at any time you see a barn or see something of this nature, an old-fashioned working building, then it can definitely be turned into a decent painting that are fairly accessible by most people with limited equipment. The next one would be a gas lamp. Now, this was taking down in historic Charleston, South Carolina. And again, they have a building code down there that they have to have working gas lamps in that particular area. And that is such a unique feature that this type of stucco and old layers of concrete that create this old building type look work very well with washes of watercolors that you could take your oranges and peach colors and then blues and greens over it and exaggerate the color if you want to. And it would be an excellent reference for oil or acrylic, but also maybe even more so watercolor. The next one is the same thing. It's actually stucco work with old-fashioned brick, and these two doors are very pronounced in color and contrast with the blues. Again, would make a very nice photo. And then keep in mind what we have going on here also is what's called color unity. The colors in the lantern are the same blues as these hinges and hardware. And then also some of the browns and even subtle purples in the lamps are the same colors in the brick. So when you start splashing around alike colors, you'll have a very unique color palette for your painting. Another one would be actually this one right here. And this one is if you're going to more or less introduce architecture, a little bit of architecture with a natural landscape. And then again, keep in mind, we have a ton of color unity going on with all the rocks and the sandstone. And since this bridge is made out of sandstone, it's obviously going to tie in with the sandstone that's around it. And again, this is a slow shutter speed, so you're getting that wispy water look that's in motion. So depending on shutter speeds that you may use will really change the look of your photo itself. And the last one in architecture is this one where, if you can imagine, keep in mind when you start gathering your references, you don't have to have a complete reference. And what I mean by that is, boy, can you imagine maybe a couple of people walking up these steps away from you and with their backs turned, and it's a rainy, cold day, their hoods are up, and it's a very mysterious picture only because you don't even see the people. Their backs are turned to you, and when you don't see the appearance or who it is necessarily, then it brings on more of a mystique look to the painting itself, and it's kind of like, ooh, who is that walking? Where now, though, the architecture also becomes the backdrop of the picture itself also, where then if you put something here in it would be considered also the rule of thirds at this point, right here in the rule of thirds, then this could easily become your focal point of a person that's in a red rain jacket or even a yellow rain jacket that could easily jump out at you because of the colors used. But again, this could just be the start of a reference of a painting, and more could be added to it. Next, let's go into atmosphere, and that is this folder right here. Okay, now with atmosphere, that is definitely going to set the mood of a picture. We'll turn that group off. We'll turn on our first one. And again, this is Wanchese, North Carolina. And with the sun trying to burn through the fog, you have no horizon line. It disappears off into the fog. And then even the trawler behind this one is already starting to slightly disappear into the fog, which just gives the image more depth. But again, photos like this are very accessible for folks just to want to walk typical marinas and then also have limited equipment. But keep in mind, this is early in the morning, so the time you photograph of the day is going to be very important. Fog introduces a whole new element to a picture. It will actually block out a lot of things that you may not want in a picture, that we've gone to places and photographed in fog and then gone back to that same place later on in the day and think, oh my gosh, there's nothing there. And that's only because what the fog was covering up for us. And it completely changed the look of the picture. Another atmospheric event would be rain. And rain at a twilight shot is very nice. What it will do is it will give you enough light to illuminate your image itself, which in this case is the buildings, but then it'll also be dark enough to show all the lights involved. So in this particular picture, you got all the street lights of a typical town street, but then they're all reflecting off of that wet pavement. And this could be a very dramatic reference indeed for a typical rainy scene. And then you even have some folks over here walking with some umbrellas and the typical rain gear that would be needed that day. So you have a very specific atmosphere in this particular picture. Now another one, again, going back to the frost. That is a very unique effect because of the white is going to show, as in this case, a light blue, where it may actually normally be these blacks and browns in the deep shadowed areas of the swamp, is going to actually create a completely different look to this particular sunrise, and it will actually illuminate the photo much more than it really is. In this particular picture, this is atmosphere also, but again, this is a very tough lighting situation. So at twilight, there is very little light available, and so for that reason, all these foreground rocks would just be black with a typical single shot. This is a 5-image stack to give me this final composite that I had to actually bracket and actually expose for the foreground rocks, which would totally wash out the sky, and also then actually expose for the sky, which would leave these foreground rocks just about pure black. But with all 5 of those images stacked together, then this is what I get. But for atmosphere, twilight is one of my favorite times to photograph in general. Here's a very interesting atmospheric effect. In this particular building of the church, again, this is the same place I photographed the statues. This is a very vivid yellow tree in fall that's being hit by direct sunlight, and it is completely reflecting on this building. Now, if you go back up into here, you start going back into blues and purples, and the same thing from the edge of this building over is also just typical straight available light. But where this tree is in front of this building is reflecting all of that pure yellow back into the building, and it's really illuminating this area and this statue area of the yellow that's being reflected off the tree. This would make a very interesting watercolor reference. Now, here's another one. This one is interesting only because of the fact that this is Scuda Peninsula in Maine. And what this is the rocky coast of Maine is somewhat famous because it is a very rocky coast. But with no silt or sand or anything to stir up, even in rough waters, the color of the ocean stays very true to it's almost like just a turquoise blue color, that the water does not get murky at all, even when it gets rough. There's just nothing to stir up, no sediment. So again, with the limited visibility and the fog and the mist coming off the waves, and then the colors of the rocks because they're wet, this is a pretty reliable image to create a unique painting from. Now this one is again atmosphere galore, only because this is fog, low ground fog involved, but you're up on a mountaintop, so you're above it. So now you can see a little wee bit of this mountain, and then you could see these azalea bushes. This is when they bloom, which is usually mid-June down there. And then also what is interesting about this photo in this area is these trees are the way they are. They are so windswept down there that there are no branches on the windward side, only on the leeward side. So they have a straight edge to them, which is very unique. And then with the fog blending into the ground fog, you could still see the sky and the colors involved also. Our last one is more atmosphere, but in a completely different way. This one would be fairly easy to do. This is a blown alcohol car on a burnout right before the start. And again, the places I was going to, some of these are very accessible. You just have to find the right places to do this, and there's no special passes involved or anything. So with that kind of a burnout, you're going to get a very limited background. And what it'll do is just like the last boat of the photo retouch section, it will completely isolate your subject. And then this way, since it is just nothing more than planes and very little linear or script work detail, this would be a very doable picture in the tracing layer system. Now let's move on to color. And that would be right here. And we will start with this image right here, which is our chrome. Now again, color galore. And because of the red is so intense up against the white reflection of the chrome, I actually had a hard time keeping myself out of the picture, because anywhere I stood, I was reflecting myself. So I did have to retouch that out. That was right in here and right in here. And you could see me bending over to take the picture, but then that was just a way of retouching it out. But this would be a pretty reliable image to also use in the tracing layer system, only because of the line work that you're using. It's still somewhat straightforward as far as planes and what have you. More color would be this kayaker. And again, this guy is doing a barrel roll over a falls. Now this one is a little bit more specialized because I used a pretty strong telephoto to get me this close. But again, use the equipment you have and you'll end up getting a more reliable photo to work from. Again, the same thing with this one. Now I put this one in because this, again, did not require any special pass or anything. You can see how close over here at the fence, how close the spectators are. That's just a typical spectator with no special press passes or anything. And this is the kind of action shot I got. I was probably maybe 20, 25 feet away from the track itself. But with very limited equipment, can you get a photo like this? And again, it would be a very unique picture to do a painting reference of. And the last one is actually very unique too. For color, this is actually poison ivy in the fall up against a red barn. So if you want tons of red in this particular picture, this red will really jump at you. But red up against red is even a kind of a unique image too. And then with the old weathered wood, that would be an interesting linear pattern to do, but then that's where you may want to start doing it in freehand versus trying to just trace each and every value difference in the photograph itself. But again, some of these photos may just be standalone photos, and once you start experimenting with your photography, you may want to just leave it as a photograph and not even use it as a reference. Okay, now in macro, this will be the next folder. I'll close this one down just to give us some room. And we'll start with this one here. Now, macro is just small areas, maybe say 2 feet by 2 feet, 3 feet by 3 feet, just a smaller area. And this is what would be the most accessible, but unfortunately, this could also be the most complex pictures. When you start talking about tons of texture or even subtle color value changes, the actual white birch tree here shows tons of detail, and this is again a fairly small area. But now if I look for something like this, this would be very doable as far as with very limited equipment. A cell phone could easily handle photographs such as this nature if you're that limited with equipment, or if you even just want to limit yourself as far as what you're even going to also paint. Again, now this one, this mushroom cluster here is something you could run across in any given woods. But now for the some artists that choose to do like the fairy tale type stuff, boy, can I even picture a whole village or a whole small town underneath these, and use this as a reference to actually paint more of like a fiction type based painting that where you could just isolate the mushrooms and eliminate the pine needles and do some other kind of base type of foliage and completely change the look of this photo. A more traditional one would be this lily here. And again, same thing, any kind of more or less conservancy or local ponds could definitely produce flowers like this along the shore. But again, you're going to start getting into more detail with photos such as this. Here is the same thing. With these flowers, there is a ton of texture and detail in this, but they're very accessible pictures. If you want to take the time to create a painting such as this, you have a ton of texture and color changes in the leaves, even little subtle purples in the flowers themselves, and then it's up against a dead fallen white birch tree that has a good bit of fungus and texture, or as I like to call it, just more or less more detail and actually things to work with, that you can get some color unity out of the fungus into the flowers and just have a variety of things going on. Now with this next group, it is actually a maple leaf, a red maple leaf, on just some granite pebbles. But here's the difference, what water will make. This one is when it's above the water and water drained out below it. And then this next one is when water washes up over it. And you can see how much it changes the picture. And that is, again, look at the colors of the rocks. And then now look at them. It completely kind of bleached them out only because the water is starting to reflect the skylight. So it's eliminating the colors of the rocks. So for that reason, again, even your timing of the same subject, again, will also produce different effects if you have things going on within the picture. Now, this last one is just orchids. Again, this could be from just a local conservancy, or even more importantly, a lot of local supermarkets sell flowers and arrangements and potted plants for gifts and what have you. And it's a good chance to take a close-up of flowers for a reference. When you have the ability to isolate your flowers, then you could crop and cut them the way you would even want your finished painting to be. Now, we're going to move on to the last section, which is people. And this one is kind of important only because people may be a very popular subject. But again, with this picture, what I wanted to do was actually have her wear the same colors as the white birch. So this type of sweater worked really well with the background colors. And again, I wanted to create a color unity look. And then I placed her against the dark background. So there is the contrast I'm looking for. So she actually does jump out at you. And with the detail of this particular picture, would make a very reliable reference. As far as some folks go, with a very unique perspective or angle of view, this was at that motocross race I was at. And these guys were crossing up so much that they look like they were gliding right over me. But technically, he's so far sideways that I'm just kind of photographing right into him. And that was, again, just how you place yourself and how you're going to position your subject, that you could create an effect that really isn't the case. The next one is a jogger in a pouring down snow. Very heavy snowstorm. This was taken in Prescott, Erie, Pennsylvania, and they are very well known for heavy snow constantly coming off the lake. And the reason why is Erie is very turbulent water, and it very seldom freezes over completely. So as long as there's open water, you're going to have heavy snow coming off of it. But with that in mind, this is a very unique picture as far as just a lone jogger still jogging in pretty much a blizzard. Again, a person doing their thing. This is down at Cape Hatteras, the Outer Banks in North Carolina. Surf fishing right at sunrise. The orange light is dancing across the waves. This gentleman just cast his line. He's starting to walk back to put his pole in his holder. That again tells a story, but again, a very unique atmosphere, and also just people doing their thing. With another example of that would be this one. Now, this is a trout fisherman, completely different environment, but now he's just tying a fly, getting ready to cast. But with an ultra wide angle lens, I was able to put this water and these boulders right in the very foreground to try and place you in the image, so you are experiencing what this fisherman is experiencing. Again, with the planes and the water would be somewhat doable in the tracing layer system, but then the texture of the rhododendrons and the hemlocks are where you would start to get into some pretty serious detail and patterns of leaves. Now, what people will also do for you is actually create scale. And in this particular picture, these waves on Schoodic Peninsula on a different day, different time, were crashing anywhere from 30 to 40 feet. Now, without any scale, that's all irrelevant, and you'd have to take my word for it. But in this particular case, I put people in the picture, and right away now you could tell how big the waves are. They are a little bit deeper in the foreground. Keep in mind, nobody was wet or in danger in the making of these photos, because these were local folks and they knew where they could stand and still be safe, because this particular area was almost like a sheer wall, and the water was crashing straight up and then it would just go straight down. There was very little to absolutely no chance of water washing up over this part of the shore and jeopardizing their safety in any way. Now, our very last photo is a typical portrait, and all I did was take this girl, Lauren, and put her up against a sandstone background, which very much gave me an alike color and color unity. But this is the dress she chose, which is very nice also, but with a simple cropping of taking the picture, and this is what I got. Now I have a very unique color unity going throughout the entire photo just by cropping off a little bit of that dress. And again, this would be a very classic portrait to do as far as with the tracing layer system to just paint. And again, this is all just available lighting. It's more of a dramatic side lighting, and then very little to no reflected use of any kind of special equipment, fill flash or also reflectors. I just left everything as it was in this particular shoot. And then again, the sandstone goes a little wee bit soft, but that's okay. It will bring your attention more to the actual portrait or subject itself in this particular case. So again, these are all just giving you ideas of what to do and how to do it when you're out gathering your reference, or if you're just looking for ideas of what to paint and how to go about it. This is the end of this particular section, and I hope it helped you in some way, shape, or form to either plan out how to photograph something or just what to pick for the tracing layer system. Until we see you out in the field or at the studio again, thanks for watching the whole way through. Thank you very much. Bye for now.